Hello everyone, gonna play some Modern. Pretty excited. Got a deck list that I stole from Zach L6 straight off of Twitter, and from what I can tell, he got inspiration for this deck from MTG Salvation, so credit where it's due and all that cool stuff. When Shadows over Innistrad came out, I was messing around with Thopter Foundry, Sword of the Meek, had some success with that, eventually ended up moving on to other things, and now with Whir of Invention, I think the archetype gets a lot more interesting. The decks that I was building were like mostly control decks, and this deck is certainly that, but in a different sense, where it's just looking to control the game with things like Ensnaring Bridge instead of like actual removal spells and card drawing and, you know, that classic stuff. So I am kind of sad. I'm less of a fan of this prison style deck than a normal control deck, you know, but with Whir, I think this is probably the best way to build the deck, so it just kind of is what it is, you know. So we're going to be messing around with this. We have blue-black base. Fatal Push is very nice, obviously, and I did think that Push would give like blue-black Thopter Foundry a little bit of a push, or God, that's bad. That was not intentional. A little bit of a boost, let's say. Let's do that. So yeah, Push gives you like the Lightning Bolt or Path to Exile variant that I think that they really desperately needed, and I worked on some control decks that had Fatal Push, and I don't know, they looked okay, but it didn't look like they were getting like, you know, that much better than the blue-white versions that I had built, because black didn't really add all that much, at least like as far as things that you couldn't get out of white. But yeah, Whir of Invention out of the same set is just kind of like, you know, the biggest deal, and it just means that you want to play a lot of cheap artifacts. So we have things like Welding Jars and Mishra Baubles and Mox Opals to help turn it on, and then once you're there, it's like, well, we don't really have a lot of slots for actual control cards, but we can play Ensnaring Bridge, and that's like this overarching, like, big control card. So then you're like, all right, blue-black, cheap artifacts, Ensnaring Bridge. Where do we go from there? Well, we got some spicy tutor targets. Have a main deck Relic, Pithing Needle, Executioner's Capsule, which is kind of baller. A Crucible to go some Ghost Quarters, which I think is really nice, and like Whir for Crucible when you have a Ghost Quarter might actually fix problematic matchups like Tron, or at least give you a shot, you know, like maybe it doesn't outright beat them all the time, or like make it so you're like 80-20 or whatever, but it gives you a chance, which this deck didn't really have before, because it didn't have a lot of disruption that actually mattered. It didn't have a fast clock or anything like that. Another thing that I think could actually help those tricky matchups is like a Time Sieve to Whir Force, and then when you have Thopter Foundry, Sword of the Meek, Time Sieve actually just kills them. Well, assuming you have 5 mana, right? It's like you have to make 5 Thopters, and then you Time Walk, make 5 Thopters, Time Walk, etc. So, past that, boom, Tezzeret, what's up? I don't think I've ever actually cast this card, like in a tournament, Magic Online or otherwise, so this should be exciting. This has always been a card where I'm like, oh man, this thing is sweet, right? But like, it was never really one of the decks or cards really that I wanted to work with all that much. So yeah, Tezzeret is like this nice card advantage engine, obviously really good with Ensnaring Bridge, because then it's very difficult for them to attack your Planeswalker. It's also kind of not great with Ensnaring Bridge because it adds cards to your hand, but the average CMC in this deck is very low, so I don't imagine that to be too much of a problem. And if it's like, you know, you have Bridge and 3 cards, you can, and they have like 4 power creatures or whatever, you can Tezzeret and just like make something a 5/5 or whatever and start building up that way, or you can just plus and not actually find an artifact. That's also okay. So the other cool thing are the Pentat Prisms. Kind of turbocharges the Whir of Inventions, kind of turbocharges the Thopter Foundry Sword of the Meek combo. Is another way to empty your hand very quickly for Ensnaring Bridge. So I think Pentad Prism is like this very interesting card and not a thing that I think a lot of people would look at and be like, oh yeah, that definitely goes in like my control deck, you know? But it is cool in that it adds some mana and then it still just chills in play, you know? It keeps your Mox Opals turned on. Still, you can tap it to improvise for a Word of Invention and all that cool stuff. So, yeah, Pentad Prism seems sweet, especially since basically you're trying to empty your hand very quickly and make sure that you have Metalcraft for Mox Opal. And, yeah, just get that little boost of mana. And, like, this deck doesn't really care about card advantage all that much. It's just trying to assemble this combo. And, yeah, it doesn't really matter. So, Pentad Prism actually fits pretty well. Mana base is kind of interesting. A lot of blue-black dual lands. Decent amount of basics for like Blood Moon and stuff like that. There could be more fetch lands for Fatal Push. I'm not sure how big of an issue that's going to be, but there are still things like Bauble and Welding Jar and whatever that you can sacrifice in a pinch. And if you have Thopter Foundry, I mean, it is trivial. So maybe 6 fetches is enough. We will see. Other than that, Random Inventor's Fair, sure. It doesn't seem entirely necessary to me. Maybe it's better as another Ghost Quarter, I don't know. And then the one of Academy Ruins, which I think is pretty much a staple in these sorts of decks. Sideboard is a lot of weird business. We got some Thoughtseizes, some Damnations, another Collective Brutality. Herald of Anguish, I imagine, is for mid-range mirrors and is also probably going to be pretty good. You know, you can't Abrupt Decay this thing. You can't push this thing. You can path it, right, and terminate and all that fun stuff, but it is possible that this is a card that might help you in those matchups, but is ultimately going to fall short. I would not be too surprised about that. I guess this could also just like double as a thing against like Valakut or whatever, right? Like, it is a reasonably fast clock. It's kind of disruptive, so maybe it's good there. Who knows? We'll see. Random Padim. I'm not a huge fan of this. I feel like if you were trying to fight off Artifact Hate, you would probably have more copies of this card instead of just like the one Miser's copy, and one copy is probably not going to do you all that much. So, I'm not super excited about it. This could be like where the Time Sieve comes in if you wanted to help against Tron, stuff like that. And then just random stuff. Witchbane Orb, Trading Post, Relic of Progenitors, Pithing Needle, Cage, and another Ghost Quarter. So, cool deck. Hopefully we can win some games. I'm not too convinced that I'm going to be able to win a lot of games, but we'll see. You know, this deck could either just be like a pile or it could be busted, and that's pretty exciting. So let's get to it.